Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze why Pedro Porro was the key player in Spain's comfortable 2-0 win over Georgia in World Cup qualifying action. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Spain in a 4-3-3 and Georgia in a 5-3-2 out of possession. And here we're going to break down how Pedro Porro played a key role in Spain creating several chances against this 5-3-2. When we look at the midfield zone, that was the key battle. And given Georgia's shape, they were looking to have a pentagonal overload around that midfield trio with Pedri, Merino, and Zubimendi operating in that central area. Yeremy, Pino, and Ferran Torres hugged the touchline to provide the width. And then you had Oyarzabal operating as the false nine, where he was capable of dropping deeper in between the lines, swapping positions with Ferran Torres to shift over to the right-hand side, but then also capable of making runs in behind to stretch the Georgia back five. So what was obvious from the offset of this match was that Georgia were looking to remain compact and narrow, especially in the central areas of that pitch to ensure that Spain can dominate that area. And they had their front two sitting in between zubimendi, and then that would still leave them 3v2 against Pedri and Merino. Merino was operating in space in between the central defensive midfielder and the left central midfielder, and he was also capable of pushing in beyond that line to look to receive the ball between the lines, as he was looking to also make runs in behind with Oyarzabal to stretch the Georgia backline. Pedri was operating in central spaces in between that pentagonal shape, but there were times where he would shift to the outside of the right central midfielder to receive the ball, whereas Cucurella and Pedro Porro were operating a bit higher near the touchline, as Yeremy Pino was in that gap between the center back and the wing back. There were obviously times where Yeremy Pino would shift towards the touchline, and that was the rare occasion where you would see Cucurella inverting and at times looking to make runs in beyond that gap, but for the most part he was operating as a natural left back here, and Pedro Porro was operating as a natural right back. It was Zubimendi that was splitting the two center backs to create a 3v2, and if he wasn't operating in between the two center backs, he was shifting into the half spaces on the outside of the center backs to receive the ball freely. So essentially you had Merino operating just and beyond the midfield trio of Georgia. You had Pedri in the gap in between the central midfielders and just in behind the strikers, but also capable of shifting into an inside left position. And then Zubimendi was floating in between the center backs on the outside of the center backs, but also capable of driving in between the two Georgia strikers or receiving the ball on the outside of them. Therefore, when we shift to Pedro Porro, he was often the free man down that right channel due to the fact that that Georgian midfield was so narrow and the strikers were just ahead of them. That meant that there were several options to get the ball out to Porro. You had the center backs who were often free ahead of the strikers that weren't applying much pressure. And then Zubimendi and Pedri were constantly capable of getting on the ball and then shifting it out towards Porro as well. What ended up happening was that whenever Spain looked to play down the left-hand side, they were capable of bringing the ball in towards central areas or simply dropping it back towards the center backs. And then from there, they would quickly shift it out towards Pedro Porro, who would have the license to push forward. In the early stages of this match, Ferran Torres was hugging the touchline, so he was occupying the wing back. So that meant that the left shuttler would have to shift across to close down Pedro Porro, and that's why you were able to distinguish how he was able to impact the game versus where he was often getting himself stuck in traffic. Whenever he looked to play the ball out to Ferran Torres and make overlapping runs, that would allow the left shuttler to come across, and then they'd be 2v2 in that zone, and that would break down the play. There are several examples where you see Pedro Porro and Ferran Torres stuck near that right touchline zone, as the likes of Zubimendi, the center backs, and Pedri were able to switch the ball out towards him. But whenever he looked to play the ball out towards the touchline zone, or whenever he received the ball out towards the touchline zone, that's where he struggled because it allowed the Georgia midfield and the backline to shift across to cover the space that they were looking to exploit. The only time where that combination was successful was when they had a center back carry the ball in towards the final third and then slide the ball out towards Porro, who was hugging the touchline, and from there the center back continued his run to drag away a marker, and that created space for Porro to play the ball in towards Oyarzabal, who was shifting across in towards the half space, and that placed Spain in a legitimate goal scoring position. But for the most part, even with Oyarzabal shifting in towards that zone, when Porro advanced down the right touchline, he was closed down in those areas, and whenever he looked to receive the ball and then play it towards Ferran Torres or Oyarzabal shifting towards the touchline zone, they were shut down in that area as well. This ultimately led to Ferran Torres shifting into a more narrow position in the half space in between the left wing back and the left center back, and that would create space for Pedro Porro to receive the ball higher up the pitch near the touchline, and from there you'd see Ferran Torres making runs beyond the left wing back when Pedro Porro received the ball, and that would create space for Ferran Torres to receive the ball in the right channel, and also create space for Merino to run into in the right half space. The problem that Spain encountered here was that, one, there were times where Pedro Porro couldn't play the ball around the left wing back, so Ferran Torres couldn't receive the ball in that zone, and the other issue that they encountered was that whenever Pedro Porro would play the ball in towards that area, Ferran Torres either struggled to get the ball in towards a teammate breaking in towards the box, but the better alternative for Spain here was for Pedro Porro to receive the ball deeper, because now the wingback would be tasked with the movement of Ferran Torres, and Ferran Torres would be occupying both the left center back and the left wing back. That would now force the shuttler to shift across, and that would create space for Porro to play the ball freely around the left wing back for Ferran Torres. The issue that Spain would encounter now is that when Ferran Torres received the ball, yes, he would retain it, but he would still struggle to connect with teammates that were breaking in towards the penalty area. And then there were simply occasions where Pedro Porro was incapable of finding Ferran Torres making the run in towards that zone. However, one of Spain's better chances in the second half stemmed from this template, and it was Pedro Porro receiving the ball in his own half, dragging away the shuttler towards him, and then playing a long ball over the top for Ferran Torres making a run between the left center back and the left wing back, and the keeper came off his line aggressively, and from here Ferran Torres did a good job of rounding the keeper, but from right half space on a tight angle he ended up firing his effort in towards side netting. Therefore, where you could see the progression with Pedro Porro having impact from a deeper position looking to play balls over the top for Ferran Torres, it was when he was receiving the ball in that deep right channel position and delivering crosses into the penalty area that caused Georgia's backline several issues. What ended up happening here was that they followed a similar template. Ferran Torres, for the most part, was occupying space in between the wing back and the left center back, and then Pedro Porro was able to receive the ball from several avenues. It could either be from the center backs, it could be zubimendi ahead of the Georgian center forwards, or it could be Pedri or zubimendi in that gap in between the center forwards and the Georgian midfield trio to get the ball from either their center backs or Cucurella, and then switching the ball out towards Pedro Porro breaking in towards that zone. What ends up happening here is that you have Ferran Torres making the run in between the left center back and the left wing back, and then you have runners in Merino, Oyarzabal, and Yeremy Pino breaking in towards the penalty area. When you analyze some of Spain's best opportunities from open play, they stem down that right-hand side, and it derived from Pedro Porro delivering crosses from deep positions in towards that 6-yard area, and he was either combining with teammates from those zones, or he was forcing the keeper into some difficult saves or some difficult clearances. If we analyze a few examples, here you see Pedri receiving the ball from Cucurella ahead of the Georgian midfield trio. They're very narrow, and you have Pedro Porro free on the right-hand side, and you could see the likes of Yeremy Pino, Oyarzabal, Merino, and Ferran Torres at the edge of the box. Pedri ends up sliding the ball across the midfield trio for Pedro Porro, and when he receives the ball, now the left wing back has to shoot out to apply pressure, but it gives Pedro Porro enough time to deliver a cross towards the 6-yard area, but he ends up disguising that cross and forcing the keeper in towards a difficult save at the front post. Later on in that half, it's zubimendi on the ball ahead of a deep front two, and you could see that you have Oyarzabal and Ferran Torres occupying the left wing back and the left center back, and from there zubimendi shifts the ball out towards Pedro Porro, and that's going to force the left shuttler to shift across to apply pressure, and that gives Pedro Porro enough time to pick out 3 runners breaking in towards the penalty area, and he delivers across towards the 6-yard box, and this time it's Merino who should nod this effort from point blank range on goal, but he fails to beat the goalkeeper. And if we look to one final example, you could see a very narrow front 5 from Georgia, and you have zubimendi just ahead of them, and he ends up sliding the ball out towards Pedro Porro, and that ends up pulling out the left wing back, and you could see Ferran Torres looking to make the run across that space in behind him, and what he does well is that he drags away the left center back, and once again that creates space for Pedro Porro to play a low ball into the path of Oyarzabal, who does a very good job of guiding the ball into the path of Merino, making a free run in towards that zone. Merino exploits the space that Oyarzabal does create for him, and from here Merino ends up receiving the ball and he turns across his recovering marker and he ends up getting a good shot from the edge of the 6-yard area, but he ends up skying it ahead of pressure over the net. So as you can see, although Pedro Porro wasn't directly involved in either goal for the reigning European champions, his impact from open play as a deep right-sided creator presented several issues for Georgia's backline.